Hello everyone, today we talk about the late medieval Ottoman feudal army element. We already talked about the Timariote in other videos about, however, early modern Ottoman warfare. Not too much is changing, actually. We already know what we're talking about. The Timar was essentially the basis of the feudal service under the Ottomans, right? The Timar was specifically a land grant by the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, which would go on as an institution throughout the 16th century. The only difference, really, with the more familiar Western feudalism, at least from our Western perspective, is that just like the old Seljuk Iqta and basically what had been the norm in the Levant, we've seen it also for the Mamluks, etc. This system was non-hereditary, right? This land granting did not entail a level of possession beyond the actual, or at least there was a specific capacity of the Ottoman government to claim back the Timars. It was not always so simple as it sounds, but this definitely is not loaded with ancestral privileges like in Western Europe. It's something more exchangeable, right? The Ottoman Empire was famous already at this point for its degree of centralization, right? We know actually less about the system than, of course, more decentralized ones, like the ones that at least formally existed in the West, meaning that the West had actually a great level of power concentration, especially if you look at countries like France, etc. But there is that famous passage from Machiavelli's Prince in which, a bit stereotypically, you have the dichotomy there, the extremes, the opposite. Also in a strategic sense, right? Machiavelli says, if you, it's very difficult to wipe out the Ottoman army, because it is the Sultan has really a great control on the same, and it's a hell of a might. It's very well organized. It responds to the leader directly as such. But if you behead the Ottoman Empire by conquering Constantinople, everything will collapse immediately, also because of this reason. Conversely, while you can beat the army of the King of France, you will not be able to conquer France, if not after centuries of struggle against every single principality that will hold its ground. And there is a grain of truth, of course, in this in a consistent way, meaning that obviously the systems were often more similar than they seem. And looking at the feudal component of the Ottoman army can explain, however, how, of course, was an important degree of privatization. The Ottoman Empire was not really as qualitatively per se amount of people and land, let's say, so again, output and productive like the West. This is great part of the reason why actually the Ottomans never had the potential to conquer the entirety of Europe, right, in spite of the threat that they posed to hell of centers like Vienna, Malta, etc. But this is also for other videos, especially the ones revolving around the 1680s re-siege of Vienna, but also a bit the 16th to 17th century political consideration and the relations between Central, Southern Europe, the Ottomans, the clash between the Catholics and the Protestants at Similia, right? But I would say in this regard, the Timariotes, as we've seen in the previous video with the one about early modern times, is a bit overlooked, right? The sense is that we, of course, like, this is a matter of impression, if you want, or of pop culture, whatever. I don't know how much appreciation there is for the Ottoman army out there. Of course, a lot, right? But if you cross out Turkish nationalists, etc., I see what is uploaded on YouTube historically, and there's not this relentless insistence on it. As a medievalist, even though I've never I specialize properly in Western Europe. I don't move that much from there. I've always had pretty and very well clear in mind why the Ottoman military was the hell that it was in a power capacity, and in fact in the extraordinary strategic achievements that it displayed. There is, however, even in this, always another consideration to make, is to say it was not, again, the unstoppable giant either, right? That's more like an archetypal understanding of the empire. It was something really portraying itself even beyond ideology. Like in pop culture, we think of the Ottoman Empire in much more Western terms that they saw themselves. Doesn't matter how truly Westernized compared to other Islamic powers they really were. But there is in part another side of this giant that, of course, was much more in difficulty throughout its history than we think, even in these early days, in the days of the greater expansion and, let's say, of the greater threat that could be posed. In any case, we see how the Timur institution had evolved again from practices that were proper of the earlier Rome, how it was, after all, just a lesser form of privatization, of feudalization than in the West, right? And for reasons that now I don't have the time to digress on, because this is not a comparison between the West and the Ottomans or the Levant in general. The sense that regions like Rumelia and Anatolia were wilder, and that the Ottoman Sipais, for example, that we also discussed in function of course, of their Timariote bases from the Western side, was that they were individually even stronger than an average Western knight, but that collectively speaking, they lacked that order and discipline that was typical instead of properly of the Western modern state. So yes, a lot of centralization, this hell of a power that stretches over 3 continents, and that as a consequence is also basically at war constantly on the same, reflects again the consequence of what, say, for which the same Byzantine Empire had collapsed, why this Islamic power was installed in its same center, but how much continuity actually was between the two things. But it all can make us forget about the backwardness of these regions, right? How these were sort of more asleep lands that you can see a bit like in Central and Eastern Europe as well, that sense of the steppe influence and of the more archaic, primitive ways, as opposed to, again, Western states were really taking over in terms of think about pike and shot armies, hell of collective discipline, firepower, and all things that, incidentally, the Ottomans didn't quite have in the same way. At least firepower, yes, right. The Ottomans were topping, especially the gunpowder firearms technology during the 16th to 17th century, but the sense of finding a strong stopping infantry, right, like in the Western pike and shot tactics, was not really there. The janissaries that are also conceived often just mostly as gunners actually were equipped with a wide range of weapons, also as melee. They were essentially assault troops. At least they could change their armament in a very ad hoc way, depending on the situation, thanks also to the arsenals that their adoptive father, the Sultan, provided them with. But albeit as very disciplined and effective, the most effective, as a matter of fact, chunk of the Ottoman army. I mean, most of the Ottoman forces were grown from this feudal background. At least the backbone of the Ottoman army was really about the Sipais, and lots of other subject routes that provided with mostly what was in the not just in the Turkish tradition, but one of many neighbors. Lots of horse archers, lighter troops, skirmishers, etc. That altogether did not quite have the same glue that, after all, the much more courageous Western face was displaying. Right. This is not to say that there was a deterministic reason for which these two systems would eventually end up politically and strategically in the way they did, but let's be aware also of the frailties of the deficits, right, of the Ottoman Empire, especially from a social point of view. Right, the reason why don't you have those sturdy infantries of just burgher militias, for example, in the empire that just like we could find in Germany or in Italy, etc. It's something that you can observe during the same Byzantine society that was much more unequal. Wealth was concentrated just in the hands of very, very few people, and also in absolute terms, without the rest being so affluent or dynamic, having a, for example, an entrepreneurial potential like the Byzantines wouldn't quite develop in the same way. Within the same Ottoman Empire, it's actually the same Greeks that are the most dynamic element, financially together with the Jews, but incomparably to, say, I don't know, the Italian bankers or other Western financiers. Just the other day, I was talking about the same topic, by the way, for early modern warfare. Hence, the feudal element of the Ottoman army was more exalted, right? It really represented the backbone of the military, and it sort of countered, even in a cultural sense, the centralistic attempts of the sultans, meaning that the Timariotes were essentially still noblemen that, in a way, resented even the same ways of war, say, of the Janissaries, right? These guys were a bit like Don Quixote, right? They still evaluated the sense of chivalry, of feudal warfare, of honor. They didn't like foot gunners. Those were racially inferior people to their standards, as they, of course, spit over a horse archer of the steppe, even though they still, felt within themselves some of the same instincts, right? But they had made it to the top as the elite, and they tried to defend their prerogatives as well, right? So today we do not make that social analysis either, but just for making you understand who these people really were, where they sort of came from, in such a truly multicultural empire that did not have that, for example, national cohesion, and that started from the capacity of putting together different chunks of a universal empire that also had very different, very few things in common at the extremes of the same. So, speaking of the Timar, well, this institution seems to have been introduced, or at least to have been there, documented as early as the reign of Osman, right? And it's certain that it predated the mid-14th century. So it was really just ancestral. It was very similar to the Ikta. The Turks had these things in part, even to that degree of sedentarization they could have, in part even in the ancestral Central Asia. And in any case, there were all these influences from the more state-like and bureaucratic past of the caliphate and so on that would sort of administer these lands without allowing or other exclusive immunities, right, for land owning to these people. Now, the Timar varied surely in size, right? The Timar is not a unit of measurement, right? But we can see the attempt of standardization to a sort of average, right? To, in fact, keep the same balance between this landholders. The value in annual revenue ranged from as little as 750 aspers or akçes. The akçes is an Ottoman silver coin, right up to 20,000, right? So this gives you a dimension of course, of the differences of there were different types of Timars, even in the way this revenue was counted in practice. I made a video about how, just for example, in Crusaders' times, you have, I don't know, money thieves or something, how many towns and not actual castles, for example, are considered to have had a revenue in the Levant at different times. Talking Crusaders there because it's documented for an era that, after all, was very close and similar to the ones from which the Ottomans rose. It's a big statement, the similarity part at least, but let's not forget how radically impacting the Mamluk military system really was all across the Levant, right? At the time the Ottomans rose to power, right? That was the biggest, sort of more influential reality, politically, administratively. The Ottomans, as we recalled also before, were very westernized because they literally emerged from what had been literally the same the Marmara Sea, something that in fact would make this power look very different also on the battlefield from Safavid Persia, for example. It was instead and truly much more feudal, but also semi-nomadically influenced than the Ottomans, right? In any case, we're talking also about very large extents of lands in territories that were, as we've seen, not so perhaps entrepreneurially dynamic, but that were still, like in late medieval times, large swaths of arable land in the Mediterranean. So, again, importantly productive and so in terms of not just of agricultural resources, but also of manpower, because they were inhabited, and of course the revenue was based on, labor force as well. The term used to define a fief in excess of 20,000 akçes was ziamet, right? The more correct term would be Za'im, which stands for chief or leader, right? Which was the holder of such larger fief. The guy was known as Timariote, in fact, or Za'im or Ziam, you find that as well. And as such, as a lord, practically was entitled to all or part of the taxes levied on his specific fief, as well as a fifth or a third of the same fiefs yelled for himself, right? That's the sort of private nobiliar gain from the holding, which is still remarkable because it's still an important amount of wealth that was, however, necessary to just administer the same fief, in part to actually provide, as we will see now, with extra troops in case of need. There was a lot of competition between the Timariotes exactly because of this reason. In fact, they were somehow more or less checked by sultanial power, and so the Sultan had the power of dispensing, donations, gifts, etc., to those who bring actually more troops, right, and would distinguish themselves as such as noblemen for their contribution to the empire, right? The fief in excess of the 20,000 akçes was initially called also has, H-A-S-S, which stands for special, right, in Turkish, and this would make the title holder known as Asay Za'im, right? So the special chief, the special leader. During the 15th century, however, the term Za'im Ziamet came to prevail, and so the name has began to be transferred to the largest type of fief that at that point was also could be also counted in an excess of 100,000 aspers, right? An immense estate in this case. And in fact, because of this reason, such large possessions were usually held only by the same sultan of the Ottoman Empire or members of his family, of course, and even some high-ranking state officials that would be rewarded with that. But here we're also talking about, say, more core lands of the empire, right? These weren't scattered particularly far away, so they were also more controllable in a strictly military sense, also because, of course, the Janissaries were stationed, at least were concentrated in large part in Constantinople, so there was a capacity there. They would control Constantinople. Machiavelli was right, did control the empire, right? So that at the end of the day, this hierarchy was tight enough for the system to survive long enough, at least. And in exchange for the military fief, of course, the Timariote performed mounted military service. I stress mounted because, as we've seen here, we're talking mostly about a cavalry-dominated warfare. This again was different when we think again about the most updated Ottoman military, say, corps of the Janissaries, the very powerful artillery park of the sultans. And so, yeah, that's a big wow. We know of other interesting things, such as how performing, for example, Ottoman snipers were during the 16th century. We'll talk more about that. But there is no doubt, again, that the strongest element of the Ottoman military was actually heavy cavalry, right? There were actually also Janissary cavalrymen, but of course the Timariotes were essentially the ones providing for the bulk of that, and so also the one of the shock force of the Ottoman army, at least as far as cavalry and was concerned. Of course, it was a lot of sort of missile punching capacity, but it's really cavalry that at the end of the day is decisive, in spite of the fact that, of course, the same Ottomans have to adequate to a more infantry-based warfare throughout the centuries, as essentially that's the gradually the future of warfare at this point, and especially the Westerners are very influential, to say the least, and this infantry capacity can be already seen at the Battle of Calderon against the Safavid, again, knights, we can say. But it's an interesting melange, right? You can't quite unsee the feudal dimension of Ottoman forces. I mean, what the Westerners were mostly impressed by was, at the end of the day, given that still their elite, their establishment was about knights. Of course, what was the equivalent from the other side? That was the Sipai, and again, it was hatred but respect mutually, both sides. And just we know more about the Western side of the story again, because the Ottoman Empire also is largely silent, at least to the degree we get more Western insight about the Ottoman military than same local sources that are also often Byzantine. They belong to a dimension that's very different from this more say traditional one. The military service was calculated on the basis of the Thimar being worth something between 1,500 to 3,000 aspers in Anatolia and 6,000 in Rumelia. As you know, Rumelia is the European part of the Ottoman Empire, at least the Balkans, we can say, especially the eastern part. And so what was the land of the Rum, a bit just like what the Turks of Ikonin thought of of Anatolia originally. Anatolia instead etymologically having to do with the east in Greek. But the two regions were the true core lands of the empire in many ways. Were substantially different, but there were some similarities, including this sort of quasi-feudal interland. For a Timar of the values we just listed, service was required from the Timariote himself, plus a similarly armed horseman that we can assimilate to the European squire, and that in Turkish was known as Tsebeli. If I pronounce it correctly, the term comes from Tsebe, which in turn actually comes from the Mongol Jebe, which indicates a male corselet. And so this would be just like in, say, the Western phalanxes, etc., some sort, of course, of, say, more lightly armored, but still substantially professional trooper that had to accompany the men-at-arms. All right, that's what we're talking about. The feudal dimension here is evident, as it's also witnessed by the third and final member required for Timars of this size. It was less well-equipped attendant, properly of servant of even slave status, but had also to serve on horseback, or it could be a groom either, and his name varied from Gulam, Oglan, or Kul. Gulam, we know what it is. These were some of the earliest terms, even in the early Middle Ages, used in Islam to define slaves or slave warriors. Oglan stands, just to recall, these have different etymologies, but it still means male slave, servant, boy, whatever, right? It's the equivalent, say, of knecht or knight, even, at least in the etymology of it, not that it was an actual knight, men-at-arms. This is just a lighter servant, basically, and it increased, of course, that sense of retinue, etc. Naturally, these Timariotes could field, again, as we will see, different types, different numbers of troops if they wanted. This was the minimum required, and it was in many ways already a lot. I mean, this is not to say that the Timariote would be eager to serve to the excess of its resources, but as we will see, there were also larger retinues, a bit like in the West at this point. In any case, the sense that this bit sort of more Eastern steppe idea of what a man-at-arm has to fight like, in a bit more primitive and archaic way is evident, right? It's as if in these places the Middle Ages had lasted longer in perspective. For each additional 3,000 aspers, or 4,000 in the case of a Ceri-bashi, and 5,000 in the case of Za'im or Sanjak Bey, one extra Tsebeli was required. Right, so another more likely armored guy with a corselet of some sort. And on this basis, it was acknowledged that a large fief could field as many as 15 men, which, as you understand, are, double a length, right? If you look at the equivalent of Western Europe at this point. This figure of the 3,000 aspers in excess refers to Rumelia, by the way, while it seems that in the other regions of the empire, the Timariote was likely obliged to field a soldier for each 2,000 extra aspers instead. And I think that this has to do mostly with the the fact that paradoxically Rumelia was richer than the other provinces that thus had less negotiable power. So paradoxically, even though they had less, of course, the especially the cost of life of those who had to be levied as an extra here was lower, and there was less that they could do, right? But likely were also troops of inferior quality on average. So Bashi is an Ottoman gubernatorial title used to describe different positions within the Ottoman hierarchy. So here, that's what we get, 4,000. In fact, in case of this guy, 5,000 in the case of Za'im and Sancak Bey. The Sancak Bey was the title given in the Ottoman Empire to a bey, that is a high-ranking officer, but not usually a pasha. It was appointed to the military in administrative command of a district known as Sancak, that was essentially like a province. It took the name after the standard was fixed in the early Turkic migrations had taken place. That's how the Ottomans had financially overlapped at least with the local districts they had occupied with their military during the times of the conquest. So this extra tsebeli was fielded, and you could have at some point, of course, much more than, as we've seen, this thousands aspers in excess, for which you would have this larger retinues, even of 15 men, right? So this would form, again, the equivalent of a autonomous tactical unit at the lower level among these essentially cavalrymen, as we've seen here. Some Timariotes, however, provided up to 50 more tsebelu than required, which is similar to what happened in part to feudal Europe, when the size of the retinue at some point depended on, or was even established on the basis of the Timariotes' personal standing. And of course, there was some autonomy regarding to this. I mean, if some of these Timariotes wanted to engage in some sort of military business or career, they would, of course, put together larger amount of troops that would be more easily recognizable politically, also by the Sultan, and rewarded as such. Right. In fact, the Sultan himself would annually confer some money, right, to those Timariotes that had distinguished themselves with such additional military service, and it was a very sought-after award. And this, as we said before, allowed the Sultan to boost further competition between the various Timariotes, essentially making the most out of their resources, given that it was a prize, an award for them in the end. Where the value of the Timar did instead not fit specifically into the established scale of 3 to 5,000 asper units, the service of the attendant, the gulam/oglan or kul, was required for the outstanding fraction. That is to say, these attendants were needed also as field aides, some extra manpower that could be assisting the others anyway. It could be provided without too much of a cost. Consider that, of course, the majority of the expenses came from the horse, right? War horse, even before the arms and armor, because of course the horse had to be maintained, and as you know, it consumes an incredible amount of food and water, by the way, which we've talked at some point about the logistical capacities and difficulties in the various theaters of the Ottoman army as a challenge. But still, I mean, you had an empire that from Constantinople could besiege Vienna, like even at the end of the 17th century. You know that you have a hell of a logistical organization. The oldest surviving Timar register, known as Defter, dates to 1431. This document tells us that the smallest fiefs, those of only between 750 and 2000 aspers, were held not by a Timariote, but at Sebelu, right? So it's as if those sergeants, let's say, had been in charge of the Timar, right? It was, after all, again, normal. It was a smaller fief, and like in Europe, you could have this individuals of lesser status handling that. The Timars between 1500 and 2000 aspers were required, also in this case, to field in addition a gulam or oglan. And this tells you how, again, there were proportionally more these guys that could be employed in lighter roles. There were also true fighting ones, like, I don't know, horse archers, scouts, runners, explorers. Just many of these guys, given their status, were just unleashed as sort of warhounds, and they went pillaging, raping, laying waste, whatever, right? And because they were real slaves, so in many ways, God knows where they came from, that many of them would come from the actual source of Mamluk slaves that had been historically in this centuries, again, providing with lots of manpower as far as the Egyptian Sultanate and so on. So an enormous space from the southern Rus to the Caucasus to Central Asia, right? Only God knows where. These guys were just habituated to serve in the household. It was that same kind of, say, patronizing behavior that the Sultan had towards the Janissaries, that, as you know, were literally his adoptive sons as well as slaves, right? So the Sipais had basically the same relation with these guys, and again, it was a heavier sense of social divide. In Europe, there were servants. At this point, slavery is beyond, right? It's something, at least within European society, is not quite. But again, we mentioned Don Quixote before, the relative Sancho Panza. It's, of course, a proof of that, right? People of lesser status were considered truly lesser people at the time. Also in Europe, where the greater wealth distribution still, made Europeans freer in many ways, even in the servile dimension. But these divides, again, were quite rigid, and you could see them, in fact, in the most feudalized areas of Europe as well. Some of which were, in fact, like the ones in Central Europe, more similar culturally to these peoples. The more east you go, also, the more you understand that, say, the peasantry is considered as a sort of subhuman reality. I mean, if you pass through, say, from Germany to Poland to Russia, you start seeing that happening ever more intensely. Well, it's a bit the same in the Ottoman Empire. Now, the most common term used, at least in modern sources, for the all-Ottoman feudal cavalry, regardless of rank, right, is, as we have seen already, Sipai. Right, I made a video properly about the Sipais, and we'll keep talking about them more in depth. This term is Persian in origin. The Ottoman Turks had received really lots of different military cultural input for different cultures: Arab, Mongol, Persian, in fact, rather than just the Turkic one. Some were very similar in many ways, especially the Turco-Mongol one, but still different. Sipai simply meaning soldier, a bit like the Latin miles, all right? And in that sense, in medieval times, that had become essentially a guy of knightly status. So these cultures were so pretty similar as far as the development of feudal culture, right? Consider that also the Seljuk Turks, from which the Osmanian dynasty had emerged historically, aside from the various mixing coming in from non-Turkic peoples, was heavily Persified, and the Crusaders had noticed how similar certain chivalric aspects of that culture were to their own, simply because the lifestyle was that similar. You have differently assorted alternative names for the Timariote, which one of which is in fact Timar-Sipailer. So literally say that I'm a Timariote soldier, right? And you have many others again in the sources. For example, Timar Sahibi, Erleri, El-i Timar. Now the etymologies are not so important, but the important here is the sense of duty, right, of fealty, right? It's similar to, again, feudal Europe, from the side of the Timariote, whose failure to perform his requisite military obligations he had towards the Sultan, that namely controlled everything, resulted in the temporary or permanent confiscation of all or part of a Timariote's fief. This is interesting because it shows you how, let's say, what a greater control there was in the Ottoman Empire towards on the fiefs proper, compared to Europe, where, yes, I mean, so some vassals could be deprived of their possessions, whatever, but generally speaking, they were much more better installed and sort of entrenched in their own prerogatives, right? Even though, again, social crisis could do the same. Again, chivalry, also against the same Ottomans in these couple of centuries, is, as you know, pretty tested. Everything is professionalizing. States are rising. Made multiple videos recently on this topics, and we have just begun to talk about companies during the 14th to 15th century. And there is a Western source of the end of the 15th century telling that, however, sipais were assembled with difficulty, and that they were poorly armed. Right, some would carry a lance, but others only a sword and a bow. Now, this, of course, shows a bit what I was telling you before, that the way the Timariote system was organized, after all, stemmed from the simple, spontaneous reality of these Turks having settled having swarmed into Rumelia, having just seized control of these territories. They were not, in spite of, say, sultanial power, also that directly occupied. It was obviously a degree of decentralization, of autonomy of some sort. It's just, again, the socio-economical balance that makes it at some point easier to control the fiefs locally. Again, the Byzantine Empire was already less feudal than the West. It had always been. So in a way, the Ottomans overlapped with this. And the idea, however, is that also the Ottoman conquests had not particularly helped, boosting the the fluidity, especially of the interland areas. I mean, they had been conquered, there had been wars, there had been a general crisis and decline of the state because of the same Ottoman conquest. So again, there was a great new power that was finally now providing stability. But aside from the fact that in these centuries that power was yet to be consolidated, the sense is that this world has become ever more rural. In a sense, it has lost the chance to westernize from quite a while. I mean, think about Hungary. Hungary, at least, in spite of the oligarchic issues it always had to keep the country together, etc., was an actual state, was an actual power, right? A regional monarchy. After the Ottomans conquer it, and of course occupy it and keep ruling it, in some ways, it undergoes a sort of public disgregation, so it privatizes further. Certain areas become frontier areas. So there is always a decay of this, and this is actually the place where all this sort of cavalrymen, even just by lifestyle on the frontier, sort of thrive, but within a pretty local dimension. So what the Western observer here was indicating, of course, is that the Sipais, in spite of the Timariote requirements, of course, it couldn't be just perfect, right? Some were under-equipped. They didn't even have a lance. Maybe in some ways this was their way of war, but in many ways, of course, there was a difficulty in arraying them, just in equipping them. They were provincial forces, after all, at large, especially in some areas. They would have looked really like this, right? Of course, these problems were there also in the West. We made videos about the obvious constant understrength organic that every company would have, because also speculation, all this stuff. So this is completely normal, especially in times of war. Here it seems mostly referring to a mastering function, but of course it has to do with a broader cultural concept of the fact that this world was living without an actual state, especially in the periphery. Everything was Constantinople, and the rest was just a province in many ways. But also that divide is important to stress. So speaking of organic, just we mentioned it, on campaign, the Sipais were organized on a decimal basis. This is normal for Turco-Mongol armies. Historically, it had always remained a tradition. The largest Sipais units were of 1,000 men. They were commanded by an ally bey, which was an important officer. The translation of the term was master leader. The guy was also known sometimes as Bin-bashi, which means chief, in fact, of 1,000, a chiliarch, right, in the Greek Byzantine terminology. The idea was that these officers were elected from within the same Sipais. This is important to stress, not just on a community basis locally, because of course they were these were the local elite, right? In many ways they ran the land and they had to self-organize from a military point of view, but because of course they had a sense of status, and so there couldn't quite be someone who could impose on them their leaders, and they would elect their own. This mentality is extremely fascinating because, as we were hinting at before, there was actually a very strong tension towards sultanial authority and this noblemen that literally thought to be fully free people, right? The sense, especially of this, the nobility coming from the Turkic steppe is very strong, right? It's not different from, in fact, what you see even, again, as I was saying before, the more eastern in Europe you go, where the idea of that there is a weaker state and that the preferential model is the guy as the authoritarian one of the steppe is much more pronounced. And as a consequence, yes, these guys may have not had, as we've seen, as much power individually as Western lords, but they still, in part, especially for this, would consider themselves as a close-knit community that had to oppose itself also militarily to the power abuse of the bigger chief. Right, they would try to settle matters within themselves, and the aforementioned Bin-bashi was the highest, or ally bey was the highest rank a provincial Sipai could attain. Right, it was prestigious and ambitious title. The guy was responsible initially, as the term says, master leader, for mastering the unit. And he was normally assisted by 2 lieutenants, the Beyral-dar, which is a term referring to standard bearing. So these guys would have been responsible for just bearing the insignia of the 1,000. And the Cabus. This was essentially a sergeant at arms we will talk about them perhaps better in some other instance, because this was a rank recurring in the Ottoman army aside from the feudal element. So each province / sanchak of the Ottoman Empire had something between 1,000 and 3,000 sipais during at least the late Middle Ages. Thus, when you look at the local governor, the unitary governor of the province, the Sanchak Bey, you would think he would have had something between 1 or 3 ally beys under his command on campaign, or at least he could rely on them, right? Given that the Timariote service had actually many different shades in terms of condition, etc. Of course, these troops were not mobilized all at once. There were the biggest campaigns of conquest on a regional scale, headed by the Sultan and followed by the Janissaries and so on. But of course, many of these provincial leaders saw action in smaller campaigns engagement. So at some point it would be surely some sort of rota system, some political way of handling this in less with a lower military potential. In any case, this was the hierarchy in the Sanchak, plus the Sanchak Bey would have a retinue of at least 20 sipais of his own. This was his personal bodyguard. He had a right to that established. So he was at the head of all the other sipais, but he had 20 for him. It's not that large as a number. This also shows how relatively modest this feudalism really was in the Ottoman lands. However, the retinues could increase in size. Consider that, as we were saying before, these local governors also got personally some amount of the local taxes that they were responsible for coordinating in the collection. The guy also had some non-military administrative duties, so he needed this money to just making the local district function. The Sanchak Bey had also, for this reason, some police officers, chiefs, we can say, in each major town or city. These were known as Ceri-bashis, which in fact stands for Commandant of Town or Castle. And we know, of course, that these police chiefs had several hundred men, or essentially militia, under their command, right? Perhaps at least 100. Even though normally a 100 men would be appearing as the responsibility of a ceri-bashi, that is the troop leader, so translated, which was chosen from the Za'im of each Khoda, that was a sub-district, which means that the 100 was properly an organic unit of the Sipai forces on a districtual basis. So we're maybe talking about different units, perhaps exactly separating the soldiery from militia, from the levies, or whoever accompanied the police chiefs that had mostly just a sort of garrisoning function at best, but hey, everything would do in time of war as well. Then you have also the ceri-surucus, that means, if I pronounce, I can't really Turkish phonetics, so I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but I hope I will be forgiven. The translation for this term is troop drivers, right? And these guys may have been properly the NCOs at the head of the smallest units of 10 men, like the guys who share the same tent, a bit like the contubernum. However, we know a very few about these guys, which I think, given the general level of documentation for the Ottoman army, would even be normal, right? We hear of them specifically when the army was first mustered, and this could have had something to do with mostly the recruitment. These may have been some troops that participated in the actual levy, right, house to house, leading the troops to wherever they were grouped. But the only thing we actually hear about it is the say the fact that one guy out of 10 after they had been mustered would actually remain locally, right? So he wouldn't leave for the military expedition to be able to collect taxes from the local communities when his comrades were gone, right? This is the kind of concept. You see, however, surely, I mean, they may have had different functions. We do not know that for sure. In any case, you see here the decimal system recurring. We think that there was a unit of 50. We saw it for the Janissaries as well, made at least, I don't think I made a video about the Janissaries organic, mostly about the armament and belonging, things like that, but it existed. Michael Kritavoulos, writing in 1467, tells us that at an assembly held by the Sultan Mehmed II at the very siege of Constantinople in 1453, quote, captains over 1,000, over 100, and over 50 were there, right? And this wouldn't be strange at all either. I mean, the fact that we lack the complete ranked hierarchy for the Ottoman military at this point is normal, sources wide, and of course there would always be the same needs of officers, NCOs, etc. for any military purpose, right? Not just tactical, but also organizational, administrative, and so on, right? Now, the Sanjaks of Asia and Europe were governed, respectively, by the Beyral-dar, that is to say, the Bey of Beys, meaning the commander of the commanders of the lords of Anatolia and Rumelia. This officer was particularly powerful. They were mostly the sons of the reigning sultan, so of course it was a quite prestigious political post. And the office of Beyler-Bey of Romania was seemingly introduced, or at least it's documented, as early as the end of Orkan's reign. Orkan's reign is 3024-59. For Anatolia, the reign of Bayezid I, 1389-1402. We have the Byzantine chronicler Leonicus Chalcondylas writing in the 80s of the 15th century, saying that there were two Beyler-Beys for the first time only after the fall of Constantinople 1453. Now, what he meant here is not clear because we do not know better, but it's possible that the Ottomans had basically organized already like the troops of Asia and the troops, at least the troops of Anatolia and the ones of Rumelia, as long as they were occupying the various territories, but that only after the conquest of Constantinople the two officials were respectively and formally established for de facto the entirety, right, of the region. I mean, Constantinople by 1453 was just basically an island within an Ottoman territory all over Rumelia already, and that's a very important key of interpretation, also considering that those populations were supporting the Turks or at least they weren't making the siege fail, right? It's just the city that was holding out. So by the end of Mehmet's II reign, 1451-81, there were at least 48 Sanjak provinces, 20 of them in Asia and 28 in Europe. And we have a list of this, and of course they show you how they correspond technically to, again, Anatolia and Rumelia in practice. Yes, they went also beyond, as we will observe here, but each of these provinces was commanded by such officers. So for Anatolia we have Amasya on the Black Sea, Ankara, of course, in the Anatolian hinterland, and Antalya in the south, Aydin, I think it's in the southeast, Biga, Brusa would be Bursa, Izmit, that is the famous Nicomedia, Iznik, that is Nicaea, Karaman, Kastamonu, Caesarea actually in Turkish, that is Caesarea, in the very Anatolian hinterland, I mean the key to the highlands there. Konya, that is Iconium, Kütahya, Menteşe, Mytilene, Nigde, Sarwan, Sinop, Thek, and Trebizond. So you understand these are all former famous Byzantine cities. I mean, obviously enough. In Rumelia, you have Angelo-Castron, Arta, Athens. You have the Sanjak of Bosnia, as a province here doesn't take the name out of a specific center. Edirne, Adrianople, Agribos, that is Negroponte, Gelibolu, that is Gallipoli, Gumulsine, that is Komotini. You have the Herzegovina, then Constantinople. I refuse to call it with the modern Turkish name, of course. A Constantine founded it, a Constantine lost it, and a Constantine will take it back. I'm not named Constantine, but I can always change that at some point. Kaffa, Crimea, Caraferia, Leucas, Malkara, Morea, the Morea, the Peloponnese, Nicopolis. You heard on the Black Sea, the one of the Crusade, Ochrida, Philippopolis, Skodr, that is Scutari, Silistria, Skopje, Smederevo, that is Serbia, Sofia, Thessalonica, Tirala, Vidin, Vize, and Vlora. That is Avlona. The latter is Avlona. So here you see famous, Philippopolis, Skopje, Macedonia, Thrace, etc. Right, this was of course Rumelia. Now the Sanjaks, as we've seen, were quite symbolically loaded as districts because they literally represented the affirmation of the conquerors, as they had settled, like the ancient Turkic conquerors would move with all their cattle and rally around these banners stuck, the mutton's tail, the yak tail, that was the thing, with an ominous pride, right? And this is how the Ottomans had organized their territories. There is even a region, as you know, that is known as Sanjacate because it derived from the ancient, this old Ottoman district. Now, the number and arrangement of the Sanjaks was, however, not definitive. It was fluid, and it did have a lot to do with the Timariote management, right? Different provinces could be provided with sort of different amounts of land for whichever political, administrative reasons. Frontiers were quite also movimented, let's say. There were conquests, there were counterattacks, etc. Calcocondylas writes or soon after the very end of Mehmet II's reign. So that's the moment, as we've seen, in which Rumelia and Anatolia had been consolidated. And he tells us of 40 Anatolian and 36 Rumelian Sanjaks. A Venetian source writing 1496 instead lists 34 Anatolian and 28 Rumelian Sanjaks. So you understand that, it may have not been entirely clear what we're talking about. The level of militarization of the Sanjaks could vary, as we have seen, not just because of the different size, but also because of the different nature of these lands. I mean, if some Sanjaks were in the very, on the Marmara Sea, well, those, yes, they for fiscal reason, they had to provide with a certain amount of troops, but they were not so important strategically, say, compared to some, Sanjak on the frontier where, maybe the Ottoman army was operating to conquer yet another chunk of some enemy land during the expansion of the empire. There is an Hungarian source that gives us similar numbers, still 36 Anatolian and 25 Rumelian Sanjaks. So they're similar, you see here. It's more than the Venetians for Anatolia, but less for Rumelia, right? And the Hungarian gives us also the figure of the troops that these Sanjaks were at least to supply. It is 5,500 Timariotes and 37,500 Sebelu, that the Hungarian writes in Latin as loricati, right? This from Anatolia. Then 4,500 Timariotes and 22,000 Sebelu from Rumelia, which makes 70,000 Sipais in total, right? Sipais here, as you understand, indicates the same, also the same Sebeli that were, as we've seen, of lesser status than the Timariotes in practice. And this is relevant because, as we've seen, they were also similar. They were armored to some important degree. In fact, they're called loricati here, provided with a lorica, right? So some degree of heavy defense. And if you look at the numbers, well, it's plausible, except for the fact that this was, of course, a full strength, and mobilizing 70,000 Sipais altogether was not really done. I mean, normally, yes, as you know, in the Ottoman army, there was all the from one side on the right or the left, depending on the situation, Anatolia and Rumelian troops and all this kind of stuff. The degree, however, how many troops would be actually levied, right, is a different story. First of all, 70,000 Sipais could have been fielded, of course, in the largest expeditions, but it would have been an enormous strain, right? So in many ways, it was more important to have smaller amount of troops. Also, some reserves and things went badly, right, out there. And it's a bit of a logistical difficulty to field 70,000 soldiers, right, for a single power. The Ottomans admittedly were the one you would expect could reach these higher numbers, but if you take, in general, especially if you consider these troops, especially as cavalry, you realize that, not counting the auxiliaries, other troops I made videos on, such as the Akinsis, etc., well, it's a bit too much, right? So that we are confident about this being paper strength, which also allows us mathematically, based at least on the different figures more or less agreeing by scale about the number of Sanjaks for Rumelia and Anatolia respectively, to observe again 1,100 Sipais on average per Rumelian Sanjak and 1,200 per Anatolian Sanjak, right? And again, by Sipais we mean here also the squires that were, however, some soldiers like the others. So in other words, if we divide at least by 2, which still probably too high of a figure as a result for the actual men-at-arms, we would have something like 550 sipais per Romanian sanjak and 600 per Solian sanjak. That probably again is too high and ideal, and still wanted to squeeze really the sanjaks all at once in the same way, right? We have the Burgundian traveler Bertrandon de la Brocquière, who visited the Ottoman Empire as early as 1433, tells us that the Beyral-dar's, quote, pensioners were each, quote, bound to supply him at their own expense, one with 1,000, another with 2,000, another with 3,000, and so on with the rest. And this makes us suspect, given that the aforementioned numbers that we've given for individual sanjak beys, military contribution on average, to think that de la Brocquière was in fact talking about the sanjak beys. It's interesting that they're called pensioners because, of course, they had an important revenue for ruling the sanjak, as we've seen, and that they were the guys responsible, of course, in the hierarchy directly to the Beyral-dar for providing this amount of, as we've seen, from 1 to 3,000 sipais, right? Which, however, as we just pointed out as well, was a very high number, right? So when we actually look at some sources about, for example, 15th century thieves lists for the actual troops that were provided across, again, the provinces, we see that not the men-at-arms, but the sipais proper were in fact provided on average from 500 to 1,000 at the very most, right? So obviously, again, the amount was significantly limited, was sort of half of the sipais, and so even for the previous estimation by the Hungarian, we can think that actually the Anatolian and Rumelian sanjaks altogether could provide something like 35,000 sipais in all on a regular basis, which seems much more realistic and much more convenient, just to handle, right, organizationally, logistically, etc. Which would also would be a high contribution. Again, let's stress that there weren't just sipais in the Ottoman army, evidently, and so Ottoman armies were. We'll talk a bit better and more about this army organization. Was a mix of many types of troops coming from different places as well. Naturally, the sipais were connected in part with this sort of connections, and they were really the provincial soldiery background, as we've seen. They would at least provide the Sultan with this. So likely that the sipais could be mobilized on a regular basis were even less than these, probably, I don't know, 10,000, 20,000 in total, right? And again, still, we're talking, by the way, the 14th to 15th century. A normal army at this point of crisis of Eurasia is 30,000 is already enormous as a number, so the sipais would definitely contribute also numerically, but evidently Ottoman armies were not just on average smaller, but they wouldn't count all sipais either, right? So this would be much more distributed, And in fact, in the same provincial armies, they had to cope with multiple threats at a time. I mean, these were the guys that even when the Sultan was not on campaign had, or maybe it was in campaign from the other side of the empire, had to still stem, to counter, to deter the various enemies that they had on the other side of the frontier. So again, they had an important local garrisoning function as well. I mean, for the stability of the same empire, and you couldn't quite simply, pull them out of there whenever you wanted all together. No, everything was much more diluted. So realistically, all right. By the way, De la Brocquière tells us also somewhere else that, quote, those to whom property or lands have been given are bound to serve the Sultan in war with a certain number of troops at their own expense. It is thus that Greece annually supplies him with 30,000 men, and Turkey 10,000, for whom he only finds provisions. So here De la Brocquière is keeping higher figures, right? Likely to say, oh my God, the Ottoman Empire is so powerful and whatever, but let's distinguish between what Greece has annually to supply. For example, what does Greece mean? Right here, likely think it means Rumelia. It says Turkey 10,000, right? But it's not necessarily to be seen that such regions every year would actually provide these forces, right? It is true that the Sultan would fight very often at some point in Ottoman history, but at the same time there were different ways to actually, and different troops actually just to provide. And here we already have 40,000, right? And the interesting thing here is that it says how from Constantinople the Sultan would contribute to the provisions, right? Would, in other words, take care of the logistics as such. This is kind of obvious. Constantinople had just developed like this in Byzantine times in many ways, and now having been revived in its function under the Ottomans, it would fundamentally keep following that pattern. But the most important thing here is that basically the Sultan has the capacity to maintain, to mobilize these forces through the supplies that he manages. All right. Naturally, here we're still in Rumelia and Anatolia, so a great part of those resources would actually flow to Constantinople at the masters of the army from the same regions at large. But of course, the Ottoman Empire is much larger, and it could have also many more supplies from other lands. In any case, these forces had also to arrive to Constantinople, right? And so they had to be supplied by the same Sanjak base, and all the military hierarchy was responsible for that. So it's a great flow, great torrent that had to compact wherever, by the way, they were stationed. Because say if the master was not in Constantinople, for example, at that point the Sultan surely took care of important central matters in order how to make the army work. But we find still a capacity of the provinces to think about that and resources from there to just fuel the system. De la Brocquière goes on and says, should the Sultan want a more considerable army, Greece alone, so I am told, by the way, can then furnish him with 120,000 more. This is nonsense, right? It's not that you couldn't find in Greece this amount of men, but sending them to just to Constantinople would dry up Greece of just labor force to a degree of causing a major crisis, right? Says, but he is obliged to pay at least for this extra troops. And this is interesting too, because it shows that, of course, the provinces had their own customs, so there was only, of course, a certain amount that the Ottoman Sultan was meant to just muster by just in theory for free, right? Which is always a controversial topic, especially by the later Middle Ages. Consider that there were lots of troops that, especially at this point, had just settled in the newly conquered territories, especially of Europe, and as such they had had a predatory as military lifestyle up to very recently that would be passed down from generation to generation. So the idea is that as long as there was more to conquer, it was easier to mobilize these forces, even without like just rewarding them with the conquest, with anything that the Sultan would have, right? By the way, at this point, Constantinople is not fallen yet, so the Sultan would already have an important logistical management, of course, for putting together these armies, but it could have never happened. In fact, if it had been just him organizing that, it was all this system that was held together by much thinner threads than we think. The numbers are important, but they also refer to lighter troops on average than ones you would have seen in the West, right? De la Brocquière goes on and says the pay is 5 aspers for the infantry and 8 for the cavalry. I have, however, heard that of these 120,000 there was but a half, that is to say, the cavalry, interesting ratio here, that were properly equipped and well armed with tarques, that is the quiver basically, and sword, tarque in French, de la Brocquière. And the rest were composed of men on foot, miserably accoutred. And so here, 120,000 is just the, he's talking, remember, just about Greece, so it doesn't make any sense. Evermore, if you say that half of these were horsemen, the only thing making sense, of course, is that, as I was saying before, in this first half of the 15th century, you would see lots of horse archers, raiders, troops that had come from even God knows where. Like, these weren't necessarily people who had grown in the Osmanian dominion. They may have come as far as Central Asia, as we were saying before. This thing still happened, right? There were renegades also of all sorts, like we do not know, but it would figure as here he doesn't say sipais, so troops, so it's evidently not the case. Even more when he says that, of course, the foot were just pretty poor in many ways. But 60,000 horse archers is, of course, ridiculous for Greece just to be summoned, but it doesn't, you don't even need them, frankly. Especially if you don't actually, well, okay, some of them here is not it's not specifying, but of course it would be heavy cavalrymen among these, but still 60,000 already just from Greece alone, which I think he means Rumelia, is too much, and it's just not really realistic. By the way, the same author adds, quote, other persons whose testimony I regard as authentic, have since told me that the troops Turkey is obliged to furnish when the Sultan wants to form an army amount to 30,000 men, and those from Greece 20,000. So this is Anatolia and Rumelia, in a time in which this, at least the ratio, makes sense, because first of all he's saying that actually there are at least these are the troops that the locals are obliged to provide to the Sultan, and they are reduced to 20,000 for Greece, so 1/6 of what he said before. Of course, on paper, if you look even at medieval armies, there were some sort of accounts telling us literally, I don't know, even for much earlier times, of impossible numbers of knights, say, that every country could field. And it's not that there weren't such knights, it's that they couldn't be levied at any time altogether. Here, in the first half of the 15th century, it's realistic that it says Rumelia has less forces than Anatolia, so it's probably correct here. Then we have Constantine Mihailovich, that, as you know, a hell of a source, because the guy served he was a janissary himself between 1455 1463, and so he unfortunately doesn't tell us all what we would like to know. But for today's topic, he says this much, that the Anatolian Sipais were 60,000 and Rumelia's 70,000. So again, this probably is paper strength. We have another source saying that Anatolia could field 30,000 and Rumelia 80,000, which is also, again, the idea that Rumelia was richer unitly is reiterated by this by the sources altogether. Another source goes as far as saying that 150,000 Sipais could be fielded in all. But I think it's pretty obvious that here we're in the realm of, yes, in theory, like there are so many Sipais in the Ottoman Empire, but this has barely anything to do with how many operations could be put together at any given point. Of course, realizing that Ottoman armies were also pretty large, with tens of thousands of troops, but again, as you would imagine, for a pretty big power like this one at the time, that was, however, not immune from logistical or administrative or organizational, operational problems just because it was bigger. On the contrary, right? An army, again, already at this point surpassing 30,000 men is, a miracle, maybe not, but let's say in order for it to be, functional, it's definitely a challenge. 50,000 is definitely a miracle in many ways, and consider that everything can get worse depending on which terrain you go. The Ottomans also need a lot of artillery, so all these numbers can be very useful, especially if you unleash some raiders in front of the bigger army just to lay waste, to forage, all this stuff. But this is in fact typical. We've seen it also in the series about Vienna 1683. These aren't technically, even forces that are meant just to take a stand, right? They're just looters, right? They are, the Crimean Tartars called as vassals. Well, this is not the case because here we're talking about Sipais, but the type of soldier here counted in part, as we've seen, there were slaves, etc., and some of them would come from those steppes areas, in fact, would be there just to loot, right? Literally, there were certain allies of the Ottomans that would join their campaigns just when there was to loot, and when the enemy army arrived, they bailed out, said, we're not here to fight, we're here just to loot. Of course, they helped in that sense, but it's a bit of a different thing from having a robust force, right? And so that's something for which the sultans notoriously relied mostly through the janissaries. But also the Sipai numbers were definitely more contained than the one we've seen in the bigger, the bigger figures, but that still were qualitative, and that's the thing that really mattered, right? In any case, it was a functional soldiery, and so aside from all the material problems, poverty, etc., the pre-industrial world, these armies were never optimally mastered, put together, fighting, and during the campaign things deteriorated pretty quickly, but it was completely normal. And for the rest, yes, these were efficient troops, and we will keep talking about them, especially looking at their equipment, etc. I don't remember which video I made about the Sipais. I'm searching for my own stuff, and you have, yes, I made a video about the Ottoman Sipais, the Capiculu and Timariote cavalry from 1500 to 1650. Yeah, and that's the Capiculu was something more elite, was part of the Sultan forces, but the Timariotes, as we explain in that video, were of course the backbone, right? So it's think very important to look at that and to appreciate much of this military development throughout the various eras also of Ottoman history. And this moment of the rise, somehow forgotten compared, I don't know, to Suleiman, the great times, etc. But of course, these are also the years of the conquest of Constantinople. The Ottomans were really a young power in many ways, and we will keep observing this rise to power, the compaction, right, of their forces. But at the same time, there had been pretty much a standard that had evolved alongside the patterns of the times, so nothing incredibly structural, listically complicated, right? Everything was more fluid, and hence why you have to always look at these numbers and say, well, they would have not been so effective if they actually fielded all these troops all together. Would have been no need whatsoever. There would have been just some sort of desperation, and not actually discipline, order, and functionality that Ottoman armies definitely had in many ways. And understanding, in fact, also these various chunks, these various elements, just per se, makes you see how, even how, this backbone was capable of gluing together various heterogeneous forces throughout this time, and still to the effect that made the Ottoman imperial force at the time. In any case, for today I stop it here. We will hopefully talk about Ottoman warfare soon again. I mean, there is always a lot to discuss, and we haven't even began to talk about warfare. Anything that we covered so far was about any topic was just an introduction, a minimal one. For today, however, stop it here again. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.